March 1983. Pointe Coupee Parish, Louisiana. The cold that morning carried a smell. Standing water and decomposing cypress bark. The particular mineral bite of a South Louisiana backswamp in early spring when the flood pulse had not yet broken, and the water sat at exactly 11 inches over black peat muck that pulled a boot heel down 2 inches with every step. Roy Meador felt it through the rubber soles before he reached the waterline. He was 63 years old and had walked this margin of land since he was 9, first beside his father and then alone, and he knew the difference between a swamp that was dying and one that was working. This one was working. The water clarity ran to about 4 inches before it greened into phytoplankton bloom. Roy crouched at the water's edge and pressed 2 fingers into the muck and brought them up and rubbed the soil between thumb and forefinger, the way his father had taught him, the way you test whether the organic content is rich enough to sustain what you intend to put in it. The muck came up black and faintly warm, the way good muck always is when microbial activity runs at full temperature beneath the surface cold. He had signed the lease 11 days ago. 280 acres of classified backswamp from Baton Rouge Timber Holdings at $38 per acre per year. The 10-year lease totaled $106,400. Roy had secured it by signing a lien against his house on Bringier Street in New Roads, a house he had owned outright since 1971 and which the Pointe Coupee Parish tax assessor had valued at $54,000 the previous October. If the plan failed, the house went. His daughter Denise was in her 2nd year at Nicholls State University in Thibodaux. The fall tuition bill was $840. Roy stood. He dried his fingers on the thigh of his work pants. 3 weeks earlier, he had driven 40 minutes to Baton Rouge and presented his proposal to the Louisiana Cooperative Extension Service. He had carried a folder of his father's handwritten journals, 42 pages of field notes, compiled between 1939 and 1954, with water depth measurements, yield estimates, and observations about natural flood timing that no printed agricultural study had ever replicated. They had laughed at him in the meeting. Not all of them, but enough. If you're still here, hit subscribe. This one goes somewhere you won't expect. The man who laughed was Dennis Arsenault. He was 47 years old, held a master's degree in agricultural economics from LSU, and had directed the Pointe Coupee Parish Cooperative Extension Office since 1977. He was not a cruel man. He was a careful man. And careful men who have been right for a long time develop a particular kind of certainty that can look from the outside exactly like contempt. Arsenault had not laughed at Roy's face. He had laughed at the folder. He picked up one of the journal pages, Roy Meador's handwriting in blue fountain pen, dated August 7, 1947, held it up, and said, in front of the 4 other extension agents in the room, "Mr. Meador, these are 40-year-old notes from a man who never went to agricultural school about land that 3 separate LSU studies have classified as commercially unviable. I'm not sure what you expect us to do with this." Roy said, "I expect you to read them." Arsenault set the page down. "Our formal position is that backswamp cultivation for crawfish production on that classification of land presents an unacceptable financial risk, and we cannot in good conscience provide technical support for a project with no basis in current agronomy." He paused. "That water will grow mosquitoes and cypress knees, Mr. Meador. It won't grow a business." He said it the way a professor says something to a student who has wandered into the wrong building, not with malice, with patience. The formal letter arrived 11 days later. It cited 3 studies, one from 1971, one from 1975, and one from 1977, and concluded that Roy's proposed backswamp crawfish cultivation operation lacks sufficient evidence of commercial viability to merit extension technical assistance or recommendation. The letter bore Arsenault's signature and a carbon copy notation to the Pointe Coupee Parish Farm Bureau. Roy read it twice, folded it along its original crease, and filed it in the same manila folder as his father's journals. He had no legal recourse that was economically rational. A formal challenge to an Extension Service recommendation required hiring an agricultural consultant at approximately $175 per hour, filing a written objection with the LSU Ag Center Regional Director, and waiting between 4 and 14 months for a response. The process would cost more than Roy had liquid. The Extension Service held no obligation to change its recommendation and no penalty if its recommendation turned out to be wrong. The Pointe Coupee Parish Farm Bureau sided with the Extension Office. 3 neighboring farmers told him, separately and with genuine concern, that they thought he was making a mistake. Pete Sorrells, who ran Sorrells Feed and Seed on Highway 1 in New Roads and knew the farming economics of this parish better than any extension agent, told Roy directly, "That swamp will take your house, Roy. I've seen men try that land before." Roy did not argue. He bought 200 linear feet of aluminum pipe culvert from Sorrells that same afternoon and loaded it into his truck. His father, Roy Meador, had farmed the northern edge of the Atchafalaya Basin from 1932 until his death in 1961. He had never gone past 8th grade, but he kept notes the way a surgeon keeps records, specific, systematic, and without sentiment. Every entry carried a date, a water depth measurement, and a yield observation. Emile had not been building a philosophy. He had been trying to understand why certain sections of naturally flooded ground produced crawfish at densities that the deliberately farmed plots around him could not approach. Roy had read the journals dozens of times since his father died. But it was not until 1979, when a drought year dropped the water table across the parish by nearly 3 feet, and he watched a section of shallow back swamp produce the heaviest natural crawfish population he had seen in 20 years, that a specific pattern in the journals clicked into place. His father had written it plainly in an entry from March 14, 1948. Water at 8 inches over muck baseline. Natural melt on black peat, holding 58 degrees at 6 a.m. Crawfish count at trap, 38 labias from 4 traps. The peat is feeding them. The pump water boys are getting 9 lbs at same trap spacing. They keep asking why. Because their water is dead water. Mine is alive. The insight was this. Back swamp muck in Pointe Coupee Parish held an organic content averaging between 34 and 41%. Measured by Emile with a simple loss-on-ignition field test that predated most university lab protocols by 15 years. That organic content, when naturally flooded to a depth between 8 and 14 inches and maintained through the late fall and winter production cycle, released dissolved nutrients at a rate that produced a phytoplankton and zooplankton bloom, roughly 4 times denser than what a conventional rice field crawfish operation achieved with pumped well water. Crawfish in high organic water grew faster, molted more frequently, and reached marketable size in 90 to 110 days instead of the 130 to 150 day cycle typical on conventional farms. The Extension Office had classified back swamp land as commercially unviable based on studies conducted on drained and partially drained backswamp, land where the organic layer had been disrupted, the hydrology broken, and the natural bloom cycle destroyed. They had studied damaged versions of the land and then concluded the land itself was the problem. Roy never said this out loud to anyone. He bought a Merwin and Hughes water depth gauge, a simple brass rod with graduated markings, the same model Emil had used, still manufactured in 1983, and drove it into the muck at 17 specific points along his 280 acres the first week of April. The water read between 7 and 13 inches at 14 of the 17 stakes. The other 3 read between 4 and 6 inches in the higher ground at the northern edge. He wrote the measurements in a composition notebook, same kind Emil had used. He wrote the date at the top of the page. He did not tell anyone what the numbers meant. He began building the interior levee system in April 1983. On the 1966 John Deere 4020, his father's tractor, purchased new from Borden's Farm Equipment in New Roads in October 1966 for $7,200, still running on the original engine block after 9,400 hours of use. It was green with yellow trim and a faded yellow ROPS bar that Roy had welded on himself in 1973. The seat had been recovered twice. The hour meter still worked. He built 7 interior levees across the 280 acres, each one 18 inches high and 36 inches wide at the base, composed of native spoil dredged from the shallow drainage swales he cut alongside them. The levee footprint followed the natural contour lines of the backswamp basin, which meant they curved and angled in ways that made no geometric sense from the road. From the highway, it looked like a man pushing dirt in circles. Pete Sorrells drove past in May and stopped his truck at the fence. He watched Roy working for several minutes, then called across the waterway, "What are you building out there, Roy?" Roy brought the tractor closer to the fence and shut the engine off. "Retention cells," he said. Sorrells looked at the half-built levees, the shallow swales, the standing water pooled between the earthworks. "How many crawfish you planning to put in?" "None yet," Roy said. Sorrells put his truck in gear. "Let me know when you need to sell the equipment," he said. He did not say it meanly. That was the worst part. Through May and into June, Roy ran the 40-20 6 days a week. The heat built early that summer, 94 degrees by Memorial Day, with humidity that turned the air over the swamp into something you could almost pour. The cab had no air conditioning. Roy drank water from a 2-gallon jug and kept a rag soaked in well water draped over the back of his neck. By the second week of June, he had moved an estimated 100 cubic yards of spoil material and created 7 distinct water retention cells, ranging from 31 to 52 acres each. He stocked the cells in late June, not with crawfish, but with water. He opened the natural inflow points and let the swamp fill through July. He took depth readings every 4 days and recorded them in the composition notebook. He watched the bloom build. His neighbor Cal Van Tureau, who ran 80 acres of soybeans on the parcel to the east and had farmed this land for 44 years, walked the fence line with Roy in August. Tureau was 71 and did not say much. He looked at the water in the cells, the specific green-brown of a healthy phytoplankton bloom, and said, "Your father used to say that color was money." Roy looked at the water. He did. Tureau went back to his beans. In September 1983, Roy drove to Baton Rouge and sat across from an attorney named James Naquin, who specialized in administrative law. He laid the Extension Service's formal denial letter on the desk alongside a written log of every interaction with Arsenault's office: the date, the attendees, the specific language used. He did not ask Naquan to file a lawsuit. He asked him to begin a formal record. Naquan read the materials. "This isn't actionable yet." Roy said, "I know. Keep it on file." He paid Naquan $150 for the consultation and drove home. The crawfish broodstock arrived in October 1983, 280 pounds of live stock from a supplier in Breaux Bridge at $1.10 per pound. Total cost $308. Roy released them by hand from the back of a flat-bottomed pirogue, moving slowly through each of the 7 cells, distributing the broodstock at approximately 1 pound per acre. He noted the date in the composition notebook, October 14th, 1983. The wider community's first formal skepticism arrived that same week. At a Farm Bureau meeting in New Roads, a man named Dale Fontenot stood up and described Roy's project as a cautionary tale in the making, and proposed the Parish Farm Bureau formally advise against backswamp crawfish operations. The motion carried 9-4. Roy was not at the meeting. Calvin Toureau was. He told Roy the next morning at the fence line in thin October light, the soybean fields behind him already stripped and brown. Roy listened, turned, and looked at his cells. The water was the right color. By December 1983, the problem arrived from an unexpected direction. The winter ran drier than average, and natural inflow to the northern 3 cells dropped to almost nothing. 2 of those cells, covering 63 acres, fell below 7 inches of depth by December 19th. Below 7 inches, the bloom cycle collapses. Below 7 inches, crawfish burrow into the muck and stop growing. Roy faced a decision he had not built into his original plan. The only way to maintain depth in the northern cells was to pump water from the Atchafalaya Spillway Drainage Canal running along the western property boundary. But that water was chemically dead, loaded with agricultural runoff, and would destroy the organic bloom he had spent 6 months building. He sat at his kitchen table that night with the journal open to the entry from January 3, 1949. Dry spell dropped a northern section to 5 inches for 8 days. Did not pump, did not flood from canal. Scraped the levee walls on the northern end and pushed the spoil inward to narrow the cell width, raising depth by 2.5 inches without adding water volume. Held through the dry period. Bloom recovered in 11 days after rains returned. Roy drove the 4020 out the next morning in 28-degree cold, the exhaust column rising perfectly straight in the still air. He regraded the interior walls of the 2 shallow cells, compressing their width and raising the effective water depth by 2 inches. He sealed the narrowed sections with foot-packed spoil and covered the critical zones with black plastic sheeting weighted with channel iron to reduce evaporation. The thermometer in the cab read 31 degrees when he finished. He climbed down, checked the depth gauge at Station 11, and read 9.2 inches. He drove back to the barn, shut down the 4020, wrote the measurement in the notebook, and went inside. By February 1984, Roy had spent $11,400 beyond his original lease payment. The lien on his house represented 97% of the home's appraised value. He had not harvested a single pound of crawfish. The first traps went in on February 19th, and the first day's pull was 68 pounds from 40 traps, roughly 1.7 pounds per trap. The commercial viability threshold for crawfish trapping in Louisiana was considered to be approximately 3.0 pounds per trap per day on a sustained basis. He was less than halfway there. He did not tell Denise. He drove to Thibodaux that weekend and took her to dinner at a diner on Canal Boulevard, and they talked about her coursework in environmental science. He said the project was going well. He drove home in the dark and took the gravel road alongside the cells and stopped the truck with the headlights on the water. The surface was alive. The ripple of feeding activity, the occasional tail flip, the density of biological movement that a dead water farm never produces. He drove home. If this story is landing for you, subscribe. More like this every week. By March 12, 1984, the daily trap pull across the 7 cells had climbed to 4.3 pounds per trap. By March 28th, it reached 6.1 pounds per trap. Roy ran 200 traps across the 280-acre operation, producing an average of 1,220 pounds per day, at peak, a per-acre yield, that calculated across the full tract ran to approximately 870 pounds per acre for the 8-week primary harvest window. The parish average for conventional crawfish operations that year, reported in the LSU Ag Center's April 1984 production survey, was 214 pounds per acre. Roy sold to 3 buyers: a live haul dealer in Breaux Bridge, a boiling facility in Opelousas, and a direct account with a restaurant in Baton Rouge. The weighted average price across those buyers was $0.68 per pound at the pond bank. Total first-year gross revenue, $243,600. And lease cost for the year, $10,640. Stocking cost, $308. Infrastructure and fuel costs across 12 months, $14,200. Net operating income for the first full season, approximately $218,452. His lien note called for a payment of $62,000 within 24 months of signing. He paid it in full on April 9, 1984, 20 months early. He told Calvin Turow the numbers on the morning of April 10th, standing at the fence line. The sun came up flat and orange over the soybean fields. Roy said the numbers once, plainly. Turow looked at the cells. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your daddy knew this ground." Roy said, "He did." They stood there for another minute. Turow went back to his work. Roy went back to his. Word moved the way it moves in a small parish. Through the grain elevator, through the farm bureau, through the diner counter on Highway 1. By late April, Pete Sorrells had heard a version of the numbers. He drove to Roy's house on a Wednesday morning and knocked on the front door. Roy answered. Sorrells said, "I heard $218,000 net." Roy said, "Close enough." Sorrells looked at him for a long moment. "I told you that swamp would take your house." Roy said, "You did." Sorrells nodded. He drove away. Dennis Arsenault heard the numbers in May 1984 from 2 separate directions. A phone call from the Breaux Bridge dealer who wanted technical documentation on backswamp organic yield cycles, and the LSU Ag Center's own April production survey, which flagged Roy's reported yield as a statistical outlier requiring verification. A field verification team arrived at Roy's property on May 22nd. They spent 6 hours measuring trap placement, cell dimensions, water depth, and organic content. They pulled muck samples from 4 of the 7 cells and sent them to the LSU Agronomy Lab in Baton Rouge. The lab results came back June 3rd. Organic content in Roy's cells averaged 37.4% by the loss on ignition method. The Ag Center's standard soil test did not routinely measure organic content in backswamp classifications because, per the 1977 study Arsenault had cited, the land sat outside the range of commercial consideration. Arsenault drove to Roy's property on June 14th. He came alone. He parked on the gravel turnout and walked to the fence and looked at the cells for several minutes. Roy was running the 40-20 along the northern levee, saw him standing there, shut the engine down, and walked over. Arsenault said, "I was wrong about the organic content. I was working from studies that tested drained land. This isn't the same thing. Roy looked at the cells. Arsenault said, I need to understand what your father's methodology actually was. Roy said, I know. He said nothing else. In July 1984, Nakun filed a formal administrative complaint with the LSU Ag Center Regional Director, citing the Extension Service's written denial of technical support and its carbon copy notification to the Farm Bureau, which had produced a formal motion advising parish farmers against backswamp cultivation, distributed in writing to the parish membership. The Ag Center's legal counsel reviewed the file and, in September 1984, issued a formal written acknowledgement that the 1977 study cited in Arsenault's letter had been applied outside its documented geographic scope. The Ag Center paid Roy $3,400 in an administrative settlement as compensation for costs incurred after the formal denial. Arsenault was not fired. As a condition of the settlement, he was required to present a formal revision to the backswamp cultivation classification in the Ag Center's official production guidance under his own name. He did. The revision was dated October 1984. The first farmer to apply Roy's methodology was a man named Darrell Saunier, who ran 190 acres of mixed back swamp and transitional marsh in St. Martin Parish. Saunier had read the Ag Center's October 1984 revision and driven to Pointe Coupee Parish to walk Roy's property that November. Roy walked it with him for 2 hours and answered his questions in the same way his father had answered his, plainly, with the specific numbers, without drama. Saunier built his cells in the spring of 1985 using the same levee geometry and depth management protocol Roy had developed from Emil's journals. His first-year yield came in at 780 pounds per acre across 190 acres. Net income, approximately $92,000. He called Roy to report the number. Roy said, Your northern cells are underperforming. Check your organic content at station spacing. Saunier checked. He had inadvertently connected 2 of his northern cells to a drainage canal that was diluting the organic bloom. He sealed the connection. The following year, those cells ran at 840 pounds per acre. The methodology spread through St. Martin, Assumption, and Iberville parishes across 1985 and 1986, passed farmer to farmer, and reported in the Louisiana Crawfish Producers Association newsletter in January 1986. The newsletter described a natural organic management system for back swamp cultivation and traced the technique to a Pointe Coupee Parish operator whose father had developed the base observations in the 1940s. It did not print Roy's name. Roy had declined to be quoted. In December 1985, Dennis Arsenault presented the back swamp organic cultivation methodology at the LSU Ag Center's annual Extension Agent Training Conference in Baton Rouge. He presented it under his own name, using data from Roy's operation and the Saunier farm as the primary cases, and attributed the foundational methodology to a field observation system developed by a Pointe Coupee parish operator based on historical documentation. The methodology was subsequently incorporated into the Ag Center's official extension training curriculum for aquaculture. Arsenault had spent 17 months working through the material. The presentation was precise and technically detailed. In the section on classification errors, he wrote, Prior back swamp studies were conducted on drained or partially drained parcels. Undisturbed back swamp with high organic content should be classified separately and evaluated by loss on ignition soil testing prior to any viability determination. Roy received a copy in the mail in January 1986. He read it at the kitchen table, noted 2 measurement errors in the data tables, wrote a 1-page correction, and mailed it to Arsenault. Arsenault issued a corrected version the following month. Share this with one person who still believes in doing it the slow, right way. And subscribe if you haven't. In March 1994, Roy's daughter Denise, who had completed her degree in environmental science at Nicholls State in 1985, and spent 9 years working for a wetlands consulting firm in Lafayette, walked the fence line of the 280-acre tract with her father. She was 32, he was 74. They walked the perimeter of all 7 cells, Roy pointing out the depth stake positions, the interior levee slopes, the location of the natural inflow points he had cleared and managed for 11 years. At the northern end of Cell 4, the cell that had nearly failed in December 1983, she stopped and looked at the narrowed section of levee wall where the compressed spoil from that first dry spell response was still visible as a slightly darker band of material running along the lower third of the berm. She asked, "Why is this section built differently from the others?" Roy explained what had happened. He told her about the dry December, the journal entry, the decision not to pump from the canal, the solution his father had written down in 1949. She looked at the dark band. "Nobody taught that in any class I took." Roy said, "No, they wouldn't have it yet." He showed her how to read the depth stakes, not just the number, but the color of the muck adhering to the brass rod at the waterline, which indicated whether the organic layer was actively decomposing or had gone dormant. He showed her how to identify a phytoplankton bloom that was building versus one that had peaked. He showed her which cells consistently ran the highest yields and why, the southeast orientation, the specific basin geometry, the natural shading from the cypress edge that held water temperature within the optimal range through August. He handed her the composition notebook, the third one he had filled since 1983. The first 2 sat in a tin box in the barn alongside Emil's journals. She said, "You're not quitting, are you?" He said, "Not yet." The 4020 sat under a metal roof shed at the north end of the property, maintained on the service schedule Roy had kept since 1967. Oil and filter every 200 hours, hydraulic fluid annually, all 3 belts inspected every spring regardless of apparent condition. The service log hung on a nail beside the driver's side fender, a clipboard with pages going back to the first oil change in October 1966. The most recent entry was dated February 1994. Roy had been offered $14,000 for the tractor twice, once in 1988 by a dealer in Baton Rouge, once in 1991 by a neighboring farmer who needed a row crop machine. He declined both times without long explanation. The 4020 was not a collectible. It was the instrument that had built the cells and maintained them, and it worked correctly because he maintained it correctly, and that was the full logic of it. Denise walked through the shed and ran her hand along the left rear fender. The green paint had faded to dusty sage in the sun-exposed areas and held its original depth under the metal roof, showing precisely where shade began, exactly where Roy always parked it. She did not comment, but she noticed it. Roy handed her the maintenance clipboard. "Oil and filter every 200 hours, not when it looks dark. Every 200 hours." She read down the column of dates. "You've never missed one." "No," he said, "I haven't." In the fall of 2001, Roy Meador retired from active operation of the 280-acre tract. He was 81. Denise took over the management of the cells, running them on the same depth protocol and the same stocking schedule, her father had used for 18 years. The composition notebooks, 6 of them by then, sitting beside Emil's original journals in the tin box, contained 670 pages of hand-recorded measurements, every depth reading Roy had ever taken, every bloom observation, every yield figure, every maintenance entry. The backswamp organic cultivation methodology, formalized in the LSU Ag Center's training curriculum, had by then contributed to the productive conversion of an estimated 14,000 acres of previously unfarmed backswamp in South Louisiana. The cumulative economic output of those operations, reported in a 1999 LSU Ag Center study, was estimated at $340 million over the preceding decade. The land itself was unchanged. Cell 4's northern levee still carried the dark band of compressed spoil from the December 1983 intervention, the organic material having bonded with the native muck in a way that had only strengthened the berm over time. The depth stakes Roy had driven in April 1983 were still in the ground, replaced once in 1991 when 2 corroded at the waterline. The replacements were the same Merwin and Hughes model, purchased from a supplier in New Siberia who still stocked them. The 40 still ran. You could stand at the edge of Cell 3 on a November morning before the sun cleared the cypress line and smell the same thing Roy had smelled on that March morning in 1983. The particular mineral cold of a working backswamp, the faint sulfur of active organic decomposition, the wet bark smell of cypress against still air. If you pressed 2 fingers into the muck at the waterline and brought them up and rubbed them between thumb and forefinger, the way Roy Meador had taught his son, and the way his son had taught his daughter, the muck still came up black and faintly warm. The phytoplankton bloom was the right color. The water was alive. 3 agricultural studies had classified this ground as commercially unviable. One man had read his father's notes carefully enough to understand why those studies were wrong, and then spent 8 months proving it in the only language that has ever changed what agricultural institutions teach. The knowledge had not been new. It had been accurate, which turned out to be both simpler and rarer than new. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There are more like this one.